Okay, you can stop asking me now. I'm going to review every car in the game. There will be some redundancy to this, of course. I have reviewed some of these cars already, but I digress. Every car will go on the triangle, and some, granted, are not suited to this track. I haven't taken off or added any armour to the cars, they're how I run them. I've only made them C-Class. To ensure fairness, I've driven each car no more than 3 times, and I am showing you the fastest lap I've done. Agile cars are obviously disadvantaged here, what with this having lots of straights, but there isn't really any fair track for all of the cars, so sorry. Anyway, let's get started. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.48 seconds, the Bandit Ripper V8 is a pretty typical muscle car. This one coming from the Season Pass 1, its handling is slightly loose, willing to point its nose at will, doesn't like to change direction quickly though. Even without armour, I would put this car here on the triangle. Bandit Ripper doesn't lose any steering under the suspension load, but it does snap a bit on landing if you aren't straight thanks to its stiff front end, and, well, I've got to say, it's a terrifying looking car. And setting a fairly average 1 minute 10.475 to get us started. Let's move on to the blade. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.54 seconds, the blade is part of the Reckless carpack. Making 241 brake horsepower and 468 Nm of torque, this car is a bizarre combination of slightly lethargic understeer and snappy handling. How those two words can be used to describe a car, I don't really know, but it's true, probably owing to its stiff suspension and 1.4 ton weight. I must say this car is probably one of my top 10 cars. It's not very fast and it sounds like it's broken, but the way it turns feels so predictable, and that can make a big difference in a race. You'll notice as we take the second to last corner it becomes particularly slow. This car performs very poorly on low G turns, which is its main downside. It does have the option of fitting wider tyres, which I suggest doing because it makes the car look kind of stanced. It also improves its grip when sliding. This car used to be unusable in C164 without armour if you just kept the bumpers. Thankfully this has been changed so it now can be. I would put it here on the triangle, and it's set a time of 1 minute and 9.803. Now, the first truly bad car, and I might annoy some people by saying that, but I'm going to stand by it, in C-Class at least. The Boomer not the Boomer RS, just the Boomer, is an extremely light and underpowered car, going from 0 to 60 in 4.73 seconds and weighing all of 820 kilos. It makes about as much power as my legs can on a bicycle. This car suffers from what the early Starbeast SS suffered from, which is a power band that's too high, and this has a power band that's too long as well, which the Starbeast SS didn't. Being at about 135 brake horsepower at 7,000 RPM and 146 Nm of torque at 5,600 RPM. This would be curable by using shorter gears or getting an extra gear for the car. Unfortunately, in C-Class, you need to be at around 105 miles an hour top speed to be viable on most tracks, and the gearing just doesn't allow for that in this car. Obviously you can't give yourself an extra gear, so you end up with an underpowered agile car that doesn't have the pull to get through corners. I would put this car here on the triangle, and with this track it sets a 1 minute and 10.702. Faster than the blade, huh? Oh dear, my voice is going already. If the Boomer was everything wrong with an agile car, then the Boomer RS is everything right with one. It is wider and lighter, weighing just 907 kilos, and it's more powerful, making 149 brake horsepower and 148 Nm of torque. It's also got an extra gear, and just in case that wasn't enough, it's got a higher revving engine too. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.76 seconds, it's actually 0.20 of a second slower than the Boomer. Owing to it having 6 gears, you've got to shift a lot more, but it makes up for that in, well, literally every other place on the track. It sits perfectly in the power band on almost every corner on almost every track. Thanks to it having 6 gears, its handling is also very snappy and it's really grippy. Thanks to its fairly powerful engine for its size, this car is a perfect rally car. Unfortunately, there's only one rally track in the game, and it is awesome on it. But on the wider courses, this excessive grip forces the driver to put a lot more input into the car to get a smooth and fast corner. This car is very aggressive, and I'd put it here on the triangle. Setting a respectable 1 minute and 9.406, more than a second better than the Boomer. I'm going to be a bit biased against this next car, the Buggy. This is a good car, but for the life of me I cannot make it work. Producing 157 brake horsepower and 223 Nm of torque, it's not very powerful, but that's fine because it weighs just 954 kilos. I don't really know what to say about this car, so much so that I've not even written a script for it, rather just some bullet points to discuss. The first thing I notice when driving it is the body roll, which digs the outside tyres in while cornering, making it quite good at cornering, up and downhill. However, its engine, I find it misleading. I can't find the right place to shift. It does go from 0 to 60 in 4.44 seconds, which is very fast, owing to its 4 gears. But it's just weird. I would put it here on the triangle, which is fairly well centered, so it should be a good car. And it's certainly capable of more than a 1 minute and 10.533. That really does the car a disservice, I think. And before I forget to mention, the Buggy is part of the Retro Rammers car pack. Here we have the Bulldog, going from 0 to 60 in just 4.57 seconds and weighing in at just 940 kilos. This car is very light for its size. That weight can go down further. I run a roll cage in it, because of its light weight and 6 gears, its power is just 155 brake horsepower and 217 Nm of torque. That's more than enough to give this car some damn nice acceleration and keep it near perfectly in the power band everywhere. Also, owing to its long wheelbase, its steering is very predictable. Now, you can't really talk about the Bulldog without mentioning, as I call it, the Bull God. This is a tournament reward, which gives the car 621 brake horsepower and 877 Nm of torque. Now, if you ever wanted to learn to control oversteer, this is the car to drive. You know you've got an animal when your peak torque is nearly equal to the weight of your car. Overall, I'd put the Bulldog about here on the triangle, and with it I set a fairly decent 1 minute and 10.684. This car would be faster on a more agile track and would definitely be a lot higher up. Now we have the first true powerhouse of the series. This is the Bullet, weighing in at over double what the Bulldog does at 1976 kilos. This car has the power to accommodate, making 326 brake horsepower and 566 Nm of torque. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.52 seconds, this car really is the epitome of power and aggression. With its long body and either stiff or relaxed suspension, this isn't really a hard car to keep on the track. But going fast is quite a challenge. In typical heavyweight powerhouse fashion, this car has no real grip to speak of, instead being turned by sheer oversteer and a steep steering angle. Past gear 2, this car pulls like few other cars do, and having as much torque as it does, it'll do so in pretty much any range of the revs. However, the time lost trying to hurl it around corners is significant. This car is part of the Getaway heat pack, and despite it being so powerful, I could only set a 1 minute and 11.368. You can thank that aforementioned lack of grip for that. I would put the Bullet here on the triangle. Next up in the Getaway heat pack, we have the Cardinal. Making 319 brake horsepower and 514 Nm of torque, this car weighs in at 1,937 kilos. Awfully similar to the Bullet. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.49 seconds, slightly faster than the Bullet, it's also slightly grippier than the Bullet. But this car has one big issue, aside from its huge weight and it often being picked by newbies because it's C162 as standard. This car has an extremely tight power band. Its two peaks are at just 750 RPM apart, compared to 1400 of the Bullet. This isn't so much of an issue if you can work with it, but you might find this car bogs down a lot in corners. I can certainly notice it, and you can definitely see it in the video. But at the same time, this car is a beast when it comes to fighting. This extra grip that you get, combined with the fairly excessive, to say the least, weight, makes this car feel like an immovable object. With some extra armour, this thing becomes a monster to try and fight. I would put it here on the triangle, and with the Cardinal I set a fairly competitive 1 minute and 10.706. Next we have the Dominator. This is a very competitive car, going from 0 to 60 in 4.52 seconds, weighing 1,511 kilos. It makes 245 brake horsepower and 360 Nm of torque. This car, like the Roadslayer, is in a fairly unique position. It has to be run at C162 without any armour on. But if you add armour to get it to C164, you will spoil its predictable and snappy turning. Like most 4-gear cars, it performs quite poorly trying to put power down in corners. When it's under suspension load, it understeers quite sharply. But because of this car's very tight handling, it is loved by some of the fastest players in the game. Personally, I don't play it too much, but despite that, with the Dominator, I set a decent time of 1 minute and 10.285. At that, this was on my first lap. The other 2 laps I did in this, I was slower, despite missing gears in the first lap. I don't know what I did here to get that time. I definitely need to play this car a lot more, because it's an amazing thing to drive. Overall, I would put it here on the triangle without armour, and here on the triangle with armour. Here we have the bizarre and kind of depressing story of the Dragslayer. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.51 seconds, the Cardinal will be a better drag racer than this. With an engine that gigantic as well, you would expect an obscene amount of power. Making a whopping 276 brake and 390 Nm of torque, the Bullet is more powerful. Weighing in at 1600 kilos, this car kinda turns sluggishly. This is just typical Roadslayer characteristic. This car was nerfed a little while ago because it was so powerful, but rather than making the car less grippy and adding an obscene amount of power to make it hard to control, they decimated its power and didn't change its steering, turning it into a very middle tier car. It's a shame really that it doesn't get any love, but it's very mediocre now, especially not getting any armour options. The only thing this car really had was speed, and now it's not got that either. It's not all bad though. This sluggish handling from the Roadslayer is relatively good, to be honest. It's kind of predictable, and just why? It's a drag car, it should have terrible handling and amazing power. Despite this though, it's very good on fast tracks. Here I set a very nice 1 minute and 10.077. The Eagle R. I still don't like the Carmageddon maps, and to be honest I still don't like this car too much. Despite Devil's Canyon actually seeming fairly good. Regardless, this car does 0 to 60 in 4.43 seconds. A better drag racer than the Dragslayer, and it makes 280 brake horsepower and 437 Nm of torque, more than the Dragslayer. Okay, I'll stop with the Dragslayer stuff now. Weighing in at 1,701 kilos, this is actually quite a good car, if you can ignore the massive saw blade sticking out the front of it, which you can't remove unfortunately. It is actually quite pretty. Having a very wide rear end, this car oversteers a lot, but in a really controllable and predictable way. It turns very tightly too, despite being so stiff, and its gearing is very similar to that of the Super Venom, so at least to me, it feels really familiar to drive. This car can be bought for 100,000 fame in the tournament reward shop. I'd put this car here on the triangle, and despite not liking this car, it actually set a very good 1 minute and 9.433. Here we have the El Matador. This is quite an underrated car with a very fitting name, the Wrestler. Weighing in at 2,142 kilos with my armour on, it makes 350 brake horsepower and 588 Nm of torque. It can go from 0 to 60 in a surprising 4.62 seconds. For its weight and my botched shift, that's very fast. This truck, handles strangely to how it looks. Honestly, the rear doesn't feel as lively as it probably should be, but it understeers very predictably, and dragging it on the handbrake makes cornering very easy with its slow rotating rear end. But where this car really does best is fighting. It is not as fast as most other cars, and it's not as agile as most other cars, but it will be fast enough to defend any position relatively easily. That, combined with its excellent balancing, means you can change direction almost instantly. I find it very easy to do that. But to be honest, I find this car kind of hard to judge. I put it roughly here on the triangle, owing to the armour that I've got on it, but even with all of that extra weight, I set a respectable 1 minute and 10.878. Oh dear, front wheel drive. It's no secret that I don't like front wheel drive, and here we have the Firefly, which proves it well. Going from 0 to 60 in 6.12 seconds, that's 1.5 seconds slower than the Buggy of which weighs a kilo more. This is one of the slowest accelerating cars in the game. Weighing in at 953 kilos, it makes 157 brake horsepower and 230 newton meters of torque. Combined with its strange gear ratios, this car is really not suited to this track at all. The Firefly likes to understeer, quite literally everywhere, and the handbrake is more or less unusable because the rear will try to overtake the front, almost as if it's trying to drive itself from the rear. Funny that. When you countersteer at all in a drift in this car, it will snap viciously. I have seen players spin from snapping out of oversteer in this car. Under suspension load, the Firefly doesn't handle any differently to how it does normally, which is actually a good thing, and its exiting speed out of corners is very good. But regardless of that, it's still very slow everywhere else, setting a 1 minute 11.216. I put the car here on the triangle. Now we have the Gatecrasher, a pretty stereotypical heavyweight, going from 0 to 60 in 4.84 seconds and weighing in at 1,953 kilos, it makes 305 brake horsepower and 377 newton meters of torque. It will pull in pretty much any point in the power band and gears, which is useful, mainly because that's one of its only upsides. The very slack suspension gives this car fairly awful handling anywhere except the initial turn, where it actually feels quite snappy, but it won't change direction quickly. The Gatecrasher performs very well on bumpy terrain owing to that slack suspension and long straights, where its 4 gears can be used efficiently. In corners, I find the Gatecrasher bogs down about as much as the Bullet does, just this is shorter and slightly lighter. It is well suited to wrecking because of its small size and decent weight. Heavily armoured, I find that this car takes very little module damage, but it struggles to keep up with other players, as compared to something like the Matador. Overall, I'd put it around here on the triangle, and it sets a relatively decent 1 minute and 10.582. Gorbie. Part of the Reckless carpack, the Gorbie goes from 0 to 60 in 4.73 seconds. Weighing in at 1,031 kilos, it makes 170 brake horsepower and 233 newton meters of torque. This is probably one of my top 10 cars, I'd say. Aside from its amazing engine notes, it's a very good rally car. Its 4th and 5th gears are a little too long for my liking, but it makes a little difference. The Gorbie doesn't particularly understeer or oversteer. It just sticks everywhere. This does make it a little bit slow on the straight, but amazing in corners. I find this car very predictable to turn, and owing to its small size, it's not that hard to put it in difficult situations for others. Overall, I would put it roughly here on the triangle, and with the Gorbie I set a nice 1 minute and 10.569. Possibly the most feared car in the game at the moment. The Grand Duke is a 2,120 kilo monster, I guess the best word for it. Part of the American All-Stars pack, the Grand Duke makes 349 brake horsepower and 703 newton meters of torque. This car goes from 0 to 60 in a surprisingly fast 4.52 seconds. Handling is, well, an afterthought in this car, really. It understeers meanly and takes a lot of force to make it oversteer, with its slack and soft suspension. But being the Duke, if you've ever fought one, and if you play Wreckfest then you have, then you know that it's somehow able to accelerate with you everywhere. Its power band is somehow unending. In terms of fighting, what this car actually does well, it's, well, one of the best. Having some of the toughest modules in the game with a base strength of 5.6, that's with only stock bumpers, you don't need much armour to make this thing into an absolute tank. Overall, I'd put it around here on the triangle, and with it I set a, for its size, very good 1 minute 11.514. Here we have the Gremlin. This car is kind of hated by the average C-Class player because of its loner variant, but make no mistake, this is an awesome car. Ill-suited to high classes because of its very short gears, the Gremlin will go from 0 to 60 in 4.60 seconds, and weighing in at 1142 kilos, it makes 188 brake horsepower and 260 Nm of torque. The Gremlin really suits its name. Not particularly tough and fairly small for its weight, the Gremlin has incredible grip and agility, matched only by cars like Boomer RS and the Raiden, but this gets 4 gears. Personally, I like the lack of gears, even if you feel a bit hard done by on some tracks, this being one of them. Regardless of that, it can make up that time easily in corners. Under suspension load, the car seems, at least to me, to get grippier, and in low grip situations, it will understeer of course, but it will still change direction on a dime. I would put this car here on the triangle, and despite missing a gear and almost crashing, I set a fairly good 110.992. This car would have cut a second off that lap easily if I had not driven badly on all 3 laps. I'm not really sure where to start with this car. It's a 1460 kilo lightweight, making 240 brake horsepower and 290 Nm of torque. The Hammerhead goes from 0 to 60 in 4.46 seconds, which is pretty good. Being a long wheelbase car and having 6 gears means that this car sits perfectly in the peak of the power band almost anywhere regardless of your gearing. But a disappointing amount of torque means that past 60 and when you're just out of the power band, its acceleration drops off quite a bit. In terms of handling, the Hammerhead feels kind of strange. It really tries to straighten out the car on its own, which is good, because when it does slide, it does so with almost alien predictability. In terms of fighting, well, I just don't do it. You should really avoid it with this car. Despite being based on a Volvo, it's actually very weak, I find, taking damage to the modules especially easily. I'd put it roughly here on the triangle, and with it I set a decent 1 minute and 10.647. Now, onto its bigger brother. Well, the first truly meta car, the Hammerhead RS, and a surprising start. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.56 seconds, it's actually 10 milliseconds slower to 60 than its standard counterpart, probably owing to the extra grip, bogging the engine down into second gear. Regardless, the Hammerhead RS is a beast of a car, making 200 brake horsepower and 179 Nm of torque. It weighs just 1213 kilos, and there is a reason why there are very few lightweight, long wheelbase cars with 6 gears. The aforementioned perfect power band from 6 gears, combined with the grip the long wheelbase gives, makes this car simply unparalleled. Hands down better than the Raiden, in terms of grip at least. The rear steps out predictably and with authority when you use the handbrake, but because of its excessive grip, it can actually slow it down quite a bit in corners, and under suspension load it understeers quite a lot more than the standard counterpart, not helped by its very stiff suspension. Overall, I'd put it here on the triangle, and I set a very competitive 1 minute and 9.178. I would have easily done a 1 minute and 8 if I'd have steered earlier into turn 5. The Hearse. Well, where to start? This is the heaviest car in the game, fully armoured, and, well, the Hearse goes from 0 to 60 in 4.49 seconds. Why am I telling you 0 to 60 times for 2,771 kilos of car? The handling is, predictably loose in the Hearse, oversteering comfortably and very slowly everywhere. In terms of fighting, it is obviously one of the best cars in the game, no, the best car in the game, being extraordinarily durable. I've survived corner bombing 3 players at full speed on realistic damage with only light engine damage to the car. I've only lost wheels, I think, twice in this vehicle. Only getting 4 gears means it will push through anything it wants to with relative ease. Just be careful. You are a target on the track, and an easy one to spot at that. This car is part of the Banger Racing carpack, and overall I put it about here on the triangle. Obviously this isn't going to be setting any lap records outside of damage dealt, but regardless I set a 1 minute and 12.509. Oh, and I suppose I should tell you its power too. It makes 455 brake horsepower and 804 Nm of torque, and well, it needs to. The Hornet is a good lesson in why a perfect balance of speed, agility and grip leads to an overall mediocre car. Weighing in at 1,669 kilos, it makes 275 brake horsepower and 392 Nm of torque. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.55 seconds, the Hornet is really very average. Having 4 gears and quite a tight power band, this car is good on short tracks with lots of turns. Having 4 gears, it's also good at powering through long straights though. When it comes to handling, it struggles to grip under suspension load because the weight drags it wide. This can be countered with oversteering on the handbrake, but you cannot let players bully you around in this car. Not because it's particularly slow anywhere, but because if you don't capitalise on other players' weak points like Killerbee's terrible acceleration or the poor cornering of the bullet, then you'll find yourself losing out a lot. In that sense, this car is a very dynamic car to drive, but overall I put it here on the triangle and I set a slightly above average 1 minute and 10.538. This car is part of the Backwoods Banger pack. The Hotbomb is a controversial car, probably for the reason that it costs 500,000 fame. Regardless, the Hotbomb goes from 0 to 60 in 4.40 seconds, which, seeing as it is a land speed record car, is quite fitting. Weighing in at 1,541 kilos, it makes 254 brake horsepower and 352 Nm of torque. This is a good car by all means, it is very above average, but I really don't know what to say about it. The Hotbomb has amazing acceleration and its drifting is really predictable, but if you don't drift it through turns, it just plows, and drifting cars is very slow. In terms of armour, this car has one of the best protected front ends there is. At least with this plough that it's got on it. I've never taken it off, and I've also never gotten this engine to red damage before. Not that I've particularly tried, but considering this for its size, acceleration and weight, it makes it an awesome corner bombing car. But its extreme costs makes it quite a target on the track, I find. Overall, I really like this car for the way that it handles. It's extremely relaxing to drive, I find, as it just smoothly slides through corners and effortlessly takes up straights. Overall, I'd put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a fairly good time of 1 minute and 9.876. Here we have the Hotshot, a car I've never really driven much or, well, paid much attention to be honest. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.65 seconds, it makes 242 brake horsepower and 336 Nm of torque. The Hotshot weighs in at 1,469 kilos, and having just spoken about the Hotbomb, honestly this drives quite similarly, except softer suspension makes the Hotshot noticeably less agile. But its wheels of course are more planted, being softer. Like with the Hotbomb, the Hotshot doesn't really snap out of corners very quickly, which I think is good. Honestly, overall there isn't a lot to say about this car without describing a looser Hotbomb. Almost like they're based on the same car, just the Hotshot is slower. Overall I put it here on the triangle, and it's set a 1 minute 11.029. Panther is a really good demonstration of how stiff suspension and excessive grip makes a, let's be charitable, interesting car to drive. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.57 seconds, the Panther, or HP as I'm going to call it, weighs in at a surprisingly heavy 1,745 kilos, that's with only a roll cage in. The HP makes 287 brake horsepower and 426 Nm of torque. The HP is an extremely stiff car, possibly stiffer than the Razor even. And this leads to some real mean understeer, which on tracks like this makes driving a challenge to say the least. On tarmac though, this car is easily top 10. That stiffness means that you can get some real good grip on tarmac, and if you can get it around a corner with a shallow steering angle, it's sure to do it quickly. Something worth noting, if you thought the suspension was stiff in this clip, well it's set to 3. But a big advantage of this car is that it's very underrated, so as compared to like the Raiden or the Super Venom, it's focused a lot less in dirty lobbies. It's just a shame that it's not quite quick enough to keep up on dirt. I've not tried it, but with this weight that it's got, it might make a good wrecker, like a slightly faster Gatecrasher or something. Overall I put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a 1 minute and 9.928. The Killerbee is generally players' first taste of agile cars. Going from 0 to 60 in 4.51 seconds, the Killerbee weighs in at an incredibly light 873 kilos. It makes 144 brake horsepower and 213 Nm of torque. Despite not playing it much, I do really quite like the Killerbee. It's got this long front suspension, which makes it able to corner really well and consistently, pretty much regardless of the terrain or compression. And while it's not especially fast, it's agile enough to get around players, forcing them to defend you, and that's where it gets its good characteristics from. This is a solid fighting car. Most players will struggle to keep up with other players on the straights in this, but its agility is only comparable to a few other cars in the game. Also, with its rear-mounted engine, it's really quite good for corner bombs. Overall, I put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a 1 minute and 10.787. The Killerbee S is generally players' first taste of a meta car, unless they play the Raiden first, of course. Sacrificing all power for near unparalleled grip and agility, the Killerbee S goes from 0 to 60 in 4.96 seconds. I really meant what I said about having no power though. Getting an extra gear and weighing in at 838 kilos, the Killerbee S makes 138 brake horsepower and 152 Nm of torque. This is possibly one of the most difficult cars to drive quickly, at least for me. Being as stiff as it is and as grippy as it is means that it can go anywhere on the track it wants with ease. If the normal Killerbee could fight well, then this can control the fight along with fighting well. Its biggest issue though is that lack of weight. This makes it quite possibly the weakest car in the game, with only 1 or 2 exceptions, so you should really expect players in every lobby to try and push you around. This car is quite willing to oversteer, but it is easily countered, and it is let down on this track by its long gears and lack of power. I put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a 1 minute and 10.192. Honestly, I'm impressed with that lap time, especially considering how long these gears are and how slowly it was accelerating. Here we are, the Limo. Weighing in at 2,679 kilos, the Limo is up there in terms of cars that fight. Bullied in clean lobbies and a terrifying overtake in dirty ones, the Limo is a beast of a car. Making 442 brake horsepower and 823 Nm of torque, the Limo is probably the second best wrecker in the game. With all that weight, it is quite hard to drive. Thanks to its fairly low profile and long wheelbase though, it is actually quite agile. Well, as agile as 2.6 tons of car gets. With a tail as big as it's got, you can force players wide with ease. If you can keep on the inside of corners, that is. But you do have to remember, a broadside Limo is everyone's favourite target, and not having that gearing to get out of that situation means it happens a lot. Overall, I put it here on the triangle, and with it I set a fairly poor, but expected, 1 minute 13.619. And here we are. This took quite a bit longer to make than I anticipated, so I'm going to do an anatomy of Wreckfest for next week, and part 2 of 3 for this series the week after. Let me know in the comments what cars you'd like me to drive in next week's video, and I'll give them a go. Thanks for watching.